Um, so just a bit of a preamble, the title that's in the program materials for today's conference is aspirational. It reflects my approach to the theater history classroom, but doesn't necessarily reflect what I'm going to talk about today. Today, I'm sharing something that I think of as adaptive pedagogy in times of crises. My aspirational presentation for today was going to be an adaptation of one of my qualifying exam answers, in which I wrote about ways that I could subvert the white male Eurocentric version of theater history that tends to be taught in US classrooms. And I think I've done that this year in the two-part theater history course. I taught part one in the fall, and I'm currently teaching part two now. My theater history classes are part of the One Play at a Time initiative by the organization History Matters, which focuses on spotlighting female playwrights throughout history. So I've dropped that link in the chat for you all to see. In fact, most of the plays that I taught last semester were by women, mostly white women. I do include playwrights of color in both semesters, including women of color. I focused the first part of this semester on the 19th century, primarily on the performance tradition of blackface minstrelsy, and I had students complete a project critiquing the modern practice of digital blackface, which most of you will have most recently seen in the form of non-Black people using screenshots of Oprah Winfrey having a strong reaction during her interview with the couple that I like to refer to as the Markles. I planned to adjust my qualifying exam answer and add in experience from last semester and talk about how being an intersectional feminist impacts the content of my syllabus, as well as the way that I teach in general and during a pandemic in particular. But we all know what happens with our best intentions, even when we think it's totally achievable in a given time frame. So instead, what I'm sharing today are thoughts on how the pandemic has affected me, my classes, my students, and my pedagogy. So intersectional feminism in the theater history classroom, or adaptive pedagogy in times of crises. I don't think I could describe the feeling of the first day of class better than Dr. Omi Jones did in her chapter, Imaginative Collaboration, Teaching African American Theater History. Jones writes, quote, "The first day of class holds such promise. On that first day, mistakes have not yet been made. There are no painful moments trying to unravel the events that led to a class's emotional meltdown, no reworking of the syllabus after I have once again allowed class discussion to get us further and further behind, no failed attempts at discussions of racism in the United States. Maybe this time I will really get it right. After 23 years of teaching, maybe this will be the time when my classroom practices finally yield my grandest visions of beauty and social change. Maybe my process will unfold in an elegant and insightful series of provocative discussions, deeply meaningful exercises, and clearly relevant assignments. On that first day, the students look at me with what seems to be similarly grandiose expectations. Maybe this will be the class that pulls all of their learning together. Maybe this will be the place where they discover their position in the world. Just maybe this will be the class that respects them while pushing them to grow. None of my students are reading the newspaper or studying for another class or masking their frustration, boredom, or absolute disagreement with what is happening in this course with the feigned attention they have mastered over the years of sitting in classrooms. None of this is happening, not yet. It's just the first day and the possibilities lay before us," end quote. So unlike Dr. Jones, I've not been teaching for 23 years at the time that she wrote that. I have barely been teaching for half a decade. I'm not teaching a course titled African American Theater. Rather, this year, as I said in my little preamble, I've taught the theater history sequence. So in the fall, I taught theater history through the 18th century, and this semester I'm teaching theater history since the 18th century. And I have looked forward to teaching this class since I first arrived at UT in 2015. I am a theater historian. My background is in Shakespeare and early modern theater practice. I love history. I'd been promised this class since the summer of 2019. Needless to say, my expectations for the first day of teaching theater history were high. Theater history is world history. In order to understand theater history, you have to understand the context in which the theater and performances occurred. You have to understand the political, social, cultural context. You end up studying an entire society when you study the theater of a specific time and place. My teaching philosophy is rooted in the belief that if that students who study and practice theater, dance, and performance develop individual and interpersonal skills which prepare them for life as active participants in our democracy. Students' responsibilities as citizens or members of their community, not contingent on their legal status, necessitate that they are able to analyze information, think critically, make decisions, and be held accountable. The pursuit of these skills is therefore at the core of my teaching, and it informs my course content in class discussions and student assessments. My goal is to teach students to think for themselves in critically engaged ways that are also inclusive and reflective in order that they might become discerning citizens. I subscribe to what Jill Dolan wrote in her article, Rehearsing Democracy, Advocacy, Public Intellectuals, and Civic Engagement in Theater and Performance Studies, that, quote, as theater and performance educators, training our students to enter an industry whose representation structures our national imagination, whose images citizens look to for knowledge, understanding, and support, means training our students to look past the classroom's walls and into the larger culture. And that, quote, we should teach our students to enter participatory democracy as artist scholars with the skills to be competent, engaged, thoughtful citizens. End quote. I had all sorts of plans to deploy the pedagogical tools I'd learned for teaching small classes, by which I mean 50 people or less. My teaching experience prior to this class was an almost 500-person intro to theater class in a large lecture hall, which we could never imagine now in the times of COVID. And then a synchronous massive online class. I transferred the massive in-person class online and taught the same class in a TV studio to a handful of cameras and student employees learning how to operate those cameras. Teaching 30 to 40 students in a small lecture hall in the theater building was going to allow me to facilitate discussions, do think, pair, share, small group discussions, poster dialogue, and more. My goal was for all of my students to leave the class loving theater history, or the very least for the theater majors taking the class, my goal was for them to understand the way that understanding theater history could help them make better theater today. Enter COVID. The vision for the first day of theater history for the fall semester of 2020 was going to be very, very different. Enter COVID. And classes move online. And of course, theater history will be online. And if we try to remember the roller coaster of information and expectations, the incredibly quick loss of the before times, and the incredibly long journey to our new normal, it can feel like August 2020 was a lifetime ago. I didn't know if my plans to transport my dream theater class onto Zoom would work. And to borrow from Dr. Jones, there have been and continue to be many hits and misses as I try to capture some kind of normal classroom experience for my students. My pedagogical goals changed before the first day of class. I still want my students to leave at the end of the semester having some affinity for theater history, but my second goal, perhaps a more important goal, has been for my class to be the least stressful part of my students' semester. I've not looked into learning sciences to back this up, but I have a hunch that learning during a pandemic is hard. Even without a global pandemic, I think learning while in a state of distress is difficult. So I decided to approach my classes this year with a pedagogy of radical kindness. What did this look like? In part, I borrowed from James M. Lang's Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning. Lang distills research from the learning sciences and presents small ways teachers can immediately make changes in their classroom, with no need to wait until the next semester to completely revamp the entire class. Some things like designing assessments with the course's learning objectives in mind weren't new, but honing in on how to use class time to scaffold content and critical thinking skills to set students up for success on assignments were something new. I fine-tuned. I got rid of exams and multiple choice questions, something that I've actually brought back this semester, as students are so trained to expect multiple choice questions that including a handful of super, super low stakes multiple choice quizzes actually is something that the students asked for when I asked them for feedback. And I asked for feedback a lot. I set up multiple anonymous surveys using Canvas's quiz feature. On Canvas, you can select a graded survey and make it anonymous so they can get points and remain anonymous so that I don't know who they are. Some feedback surveys are all multiple choice questions. Some are open-ended prompts. I do my best to address all of the feedback. Sometimes that means taking time during class to spend more time explaining an upcoming assignment. Sometimes it means working in a topic that I skipped, like for example, Greek and Roman theater, because the students requested it. And side note, I skip Greek and Roman theater, which is typically where the first sequence of theater history starts. Instead, I start in Egypt, and I explain my reason for doing so. It's to undermine the traditional Eurocentric approach to theater history, which erases performances happening in Egypt 1,000 years before the first dithyramb in Greece, which was a very early type of performance that would eventually evolve into the Greek theater proper. But the students were like, we feel we need to know this. So they got a 20-minute short thing on it one day. A feedback survey I've used every semester I've taught is a mid-semester feedback survey that asks the following questions, or more so they're prompts. It's really helpful when we ... I could use more ... I really wish we could ... And this year I added the biggest challenge for me in this class is ... Unsurprisingly, students wish we could have classes in person. They wish for the pandemic to be over and for things to go back to normal. Students express their feelings of isolation in these surveys. At the end of the last semester, I asked for feedback to shape the syllabus for this semester, and I was surprised by the number of students who said their favorite assignment was the group assignment. I shouldn't have been surprised. It was one of the only parts of the class dedicated to them working together. Group discussions in class didn't capture the same connection that the assignment did. This semester, I got rid of exams entirely and replaced them with the group assignment that would cover the same material. When the winter storm struck and took away almost a week and a half of classes, I had to adjust the first group discussion had to go, or more like it evolved and adapted, just like we have this entire pandemic. The other big assignment from the first half of the semester was the digital blackface critique project. And so I added the group discussion to that. So it absorbed that project. And so what I had the students do was meet with their group and share where they were in that project, wherever they were. So if they had already totally completed it, they would share that. If they just had an idea and they were starting the archival research, they would share that. They had to give each other constructive feedback. Students learned so much from each other in these Zoom meetings. Non-majors or freshmen who haven't had the chance to really get to know their classmates got to talk to each other, hear each other's ideas, receive encouragement and validation on their thinking and hard work from their peers. It's one step among many in creating an online community to combat the isolation of this pandemic. I've adapted, as I'm sure you all have this past year. My syllabus gets reworked, not because of discussions running too long, as Dr. Omi Jones wrote, but because a winter storm shuts down our state's infrastructure for a week, or because the first day of class was on Inauguration Day, and I did not know if we would be watching a violent coup or not. Or because the stress of the election season was too much for my students and I'd rather scale back and hone in on what's important to me, that my students are not stressed and burnt out to the point of total mental collapse and are therefore able to learn and make connections and understand how the material I'm teaching them connects to our world today. My students' feedback throughout the course of the semester is the most important part of my pedagogy. It doesn't just let me know when the class is collectively feeling at a breaking point, it also clues me into what is really working, what they are learning. And I would say even just the act of asking for their feedback, but the act of asking has to be backed up with actual adjustments on my part. This feeds a trust. They feel their feedback is important and they have an impact on the course of the semester. So many students at the end of last semester said I was the only professor they had who acknowledged that we were collectively going through trauma. While on the one hand, I find that truly depressing and I could rant and rage about that until I am out of breath. On the other hand, I wonder just how much my listening to them, my asking for their input and allowing it to shape the semester helped me achieve my biggest goal, that they leave the class with an appreciation or love for theater history. And I know without a doubt that there's at least a handful of students from both semesters who would say that that's the case for them. Thank you.